today's show, we have Martin Homent, sometimes known on social media as Red Fox Bandit. Martin is the in-house agency creative director at City, but also author, artist, printmaker, and who's worked at Havas, TBWA, and McCann. Not only that, but he's recently launched a book about creating ideas, so it seemed like the perfect time to have a chat. Martin, how are you, pal?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. There's an in-joke. I had a vasectomy the other week, and so I'm a little bit sore. But other than that, I am doing just fine.
Very good. So
let's catch people up on who you are, where you come from, where you are now, and what is it you do.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm a creative director. My background is in advertising, as you kind of mentioned, a few agencies, and now kind of essentially doing the same thing, in-house with a brand. Also there's plenty of other things there that you kind of mentioned too, because creatively I've always got other things going on in terms of, painting, printmaking. I think it's really important creatively to have, quite a lot of outputs, I guess, or outlets for your creativity. I think it can do wonders for you and help you and support in some of those other places as well. So, as I've always kind of got something else on the go, which I think is quite key.
Nice. So let's go right back to the very beginning.
Ooh,
so how did it all start? Were you an artist first and then wanted to kind of be working in the creative industries, or?
No, I wasn't. I mean, way back in the beginning, I guess I was really probably in my late teens when I decided what I wanted to do. When I look back now, I think there are moments within my younger sort of self and pursuits and things I was interested in, but it was not something where I thought, right, okay, I want to go into advertising. I do remember though that when I was quite young, my dad was talking to me about it's one of the kind of, I think it was ice cold milk or something, one of the sort of ads that were on. And he actually said to me at the time, if you think of stuff like that, you can make a lot of money. I don't think that was necessarily the moment, but it's still something that I look back at now and kind of think of. But yeah, I mean, my pathway into advertising was really through design. Design was my passion, and also what I had a natural affinity towards as well. So I went from design, and then really, I think, from an advertising perspective, my move into that was really just, I got a job within an ad agency where I was working in the design studio, and then suddenly I was introduced to art directors and writers, and I saw that there was partnerships there that were, developing ideas for ad campaigns. And I think, that was something that switched a light on in me, because suddenly it wasn't just about, visual kind of ideas, but there were, campaign ideas in there which were, used for, commercials, etc., to sell things. And I think, that kind of schooling of the people around me, I was suddenly like, okay, yeah, I want to do that. I want to be an art director, purely because, design was, where I was at, and it felt like art direction was therefore the natural next step. So yeah, that's kind of what I did. I got offered a role of being an art director in London for that agency. I actually left that agency to go to a design studio, and on my leaving drinks, the CEO said, I've heard good things about Martin. Why is he going? And somebody said, well, he wants to be an art director in London. And I actually got offered an art director position on my leaving drinks to go to another agency to be a designer. So I went there for just a few sort of months while they sorted out everything out to get that position for me. And then I went back to the agency I started at, but this time in London as an art director, working with, various copywriters, and, started my sort of journey from there.
Wow, very cool. Very cool. So obviously predominantly in London pretty much most of the time, right? And then worked up and now creative director. Now you've worked in agencies, but now you're in-house. How does that differ?
I think there's a lot of similarities. I think the move for brands to have creativity in-house, I think is is getting more common. I think it's super positive because it means that creativity isn't just, almost a service that's bought in, but it's something that's embedded in your actual brand and business. And I think that's really, really important. So it's something that is happening more often, and I think that's great. I think also there are a lot of brands that have, I guess more on the production side of creativity. They will have a lot of that because obviously it's a sort of cost effective exercise. But I think a lot of brands are also understanding that creativity also features a lot more kind of strategic thinking in there to help bring a greater value more than just saving money for brands. And I think, again, that's where the competition between in-house creativity and then external agencies becomes, quite the fight, I guess, because, they're competing on a similar level. But, I think in-house broadly for a lot of people still has quite a way to go, and there is still a place for agencies. It's just that I guess the landscape and the relationship with how brands are actually buying creative services is the thing that's changing. I think in terms of the day-to-day of what we're doing creatively inside a brand versus outside, there isn't that much difference. I think there's a lot of positives too, because you're part of the same business rather than necessarily the client and agency relationship.
Right.
So I think, that is something that has quite a positive impact because, it's not a them and us. We're part of the brand. We understand what some of the, challenges are. We're actually physically in the same space as well when we're all in the office. So again, it feels like you're part of the same team rather than necessarily what can get into a bit of a master and servant relationship with agencies buying creative services, and obviously then going through the pitching process to find other agencies after 2-3 years, however it is. So I think it's healthy. I think it's a good positive thing, and I'm pleased that a lot of people are seeing the power of creativity.
Sorry, just to take a little step back, Martin, for some of our listeners who kind of are maybe new into the industry, can you just explain a little bit more about the kind of, not just the role of the creative director, but the hierarchy and how it works in a company, but also how that has changed in the last 20 years, because I imagine it has shifted a little bit. Roles that weren't there are now, have now been created, and there's also kind of traditional roles that have totally changed or just disappeared that you don't find as much. Art buyers, for example, seem to be far fewer of them around these days than there were 10 years ago. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, totally. I think things are changing. I guess traditionally, yes, you've got creative teams within agencies, whether that's in-house or external, where yes, you've got, would have had art directors and writers partnering up to develop ideas. Equally, as you say, you've got, whole production teams, art buyers, designers, animators, a lot of kind of, different levels of creative expertise within agencies. I think that in terms of the change, I think that to me, and it's interesting that you mentioned the word hierarchy, because I think that is one of the things that's changing. I think, of the past, we can easily picture ad agencies where, teams are going into a creative director and pitching ideas to them, and they're, probably being, overly aggressive with their feedback, should we say, and, throwing them out. And I think that's the change for me. I certainly hope that's the case, in terms of my own creative leadership. But I think that's what's different. And also, I guess, this sense that, ideas aren't necessarily just about the teams of those two people coming together. There's a lot of good thinking that can come from many places within not just the creative team, but also outside of that too. And I guess that from a creative director's point of view, in the past being the creative leader of, the creative teams and generally art director writer sort of partnerships. I think that's now changing because it is being the creative leader, not just of those people, but of everybody that's part of that. And that can even involve things like getting into, more on the technology side and UX and digital experiences. Sometimes that can fall under, the creative leadership of a creative director. Whereas I think when they were growing in agencies, I remember, what was called the new media team when it was first in my agency, but it was treated very differently because it was a different thing, and we didn't necessarily know what it was or how to work with it yet. A little bit like where we're at with AI at the moment, right? We know it's a thing. Everybody's talking about how wonderful it is, and equally how scary it is in equal measure. And I think that in time that will also find its place and space within what we do, and that might just take a little time.
And how does traditionally kind of what would, for the photographers listening, which is obviously quite a large proportion of our audience, what's the relationship between creative directors and photographers traditionally, or as it currently is? Like, I mean, I know that changes from company to company and dependent very much on the size of the company, really, as to how much of a kind of direct relationship you're going to have.
Yeah, totally. And I guess the other sort of side of that too is that I think traditionally art directors, unsurprisingly, would be the ones that have the relationship with photographers. And I guess in the past as well, that would have, been through art buyers. Whereas, as you say, that's kind of pretty much a rare breed now within agencies, if at all. And I think what that's done is brought together, photographers' relationships with agencies still, but just with different people within the agency. And I guess, from my own perspective, I'm a creative director who was an art director, but equally, you have writers that are still part of shoots and are still connected to the visual side of a campaign. And I think, that as well is something that, even though those titles still exist, because you still need the experts that are, the people on the visual side or on the verbal side. Creatively, it doesn't mean to say that, people are blind to the other side of the craft, I guess. So the relationship with photographers can also be with people that are writing things too. And I think that, we're so open to so much creativity out there in terms of what people are producing. In the past that would have been not only through art buyers, but like the photo contact books that would be there, and the portfolio drop-offs and everything else, which I still think is really important. It's still something that I really enjoy, because I think sometimes when you're seeing a lot of photographers work and it is something that is just another thing on the screen, I think it's really nice personally to step away from that and to actually, sort of pour over more traditional, non-digital portfolios, etc. in that moment. So yeah, I think the relationship, is much more open than it was before in that sense, in terms of who's owning that relationship. And then I guess, on set, I think, again, that kind of varies too, in terms of, the relationship when you're actually working on something together too. So, I think from my perspective, I always try and work in a way in which I'm allowing that person to do what they do. That's the most important thing for me in terms of how I work. But, and again, I guess I'm kind of aware mostly of how I work, and I'm not necessarily saying that's true of how everybody does, because I'm sure you still have, people with sort of super strong opinions that see that relationship differently. But I think it's the same with any creative collaboration for me. I think creative collaboration is so key to creating work. You can't do something really without collaborating. Don't get me wrong. Yes, you can have moments of, kind of being everything in certain projects. But I think for me, there's a lot of energy and it totally changes a project for me when you're working with somebody else, and that relationship and how you work together to get to that end result and bring your sort of superpowers together to really elevate the work, I think is key.
Can I quickly ask you a bit of a detour question? Going back to you looking at portfolios, plus also talking about collaboration.
Yes.
As a creative director, how much do you actually, when people bring in your portfolios and show you the portfolios, how much do you actually want to see jobs versus personal work? Because you talk about collaboration, but the trouble is, a lot of the time when we might do a job, we might be like, yeah, that's cool. I don't know if I'll show it because I don't feel like there's much of me in there, or there might be too much collaboration, or like you say, there might have been an art director or a creative director in there with a very strong opinion, which I know that I've had. When you said that, how you were like to work, I was like, oh, I wish everyone just worked like that. Because I have had, some people with very strong opinions. So I don't know if you have a preference.
I think that for me, I tend to like to have moments in my day and week and work in practice in general where I'm just absorbing stuff. And I guess when I'm looking at photographers' work, I don't really see and that worried about whether or not it's been part of a campaign or something before. I know that a lot of the time photographers can also, show a lot of work, and then it's either throughout the book or it's sometimes tacked at the end where it's like, oh, and here's the image with all the stuff on.
Here's the jobs pages.
It was a thing. And I personally don't see things in that way. I don't need to necessarily see an image that has the headline and the logo and the copy next to it to see it as a thing, because I think what I'm really doing when I'm looking at work is I'm collecting. I'm filling up the back of my mind with inspirational things, and I equally don't mind if that is a personal project or not, because I'm really looking for things that I gravitate towards, things that resonate with me, and that can be, it can be a lighting thing, it can be a compositional thing, it can be a production thing, and I'm so open to all of those things in one moment. I think sometimes that can change if I have an idea that's bubbling under for a campaign, and therefore I get a little bit more specific of what I'm looking for. But yeah, I tend to find that within a portfolio, and I don't mind. For me, I'm buying the result, and I don't mind what it is that has taken it to get there. I mean, funny enough, I remember many years ago there was a personal project that a photographer had in their book. And it was shot above, and it was lots of people sleeping. And I think in between the lens and the bed, there was like a great big, kind of water bath almost, where water was dripped. So it would have an impact in terms of, what the camera was picking up, and made it feel quite dreamlike. And it was a bit of a personal project experiment from that photographer. And I was actually working on a campaign for Tesco at the time, and it just struck a kind of a chord with me, because I was developing an idea where it was people that were actually, lying in bed in different positions, and the positions they were in bed was actually more of an active position of something they'd be doing while they were awake. And it was suddenly almost like, hang on a second, that's 80% of, mine's a very different thing for a different reason, because it has that job to do in a campaign, and it has a sort of story to tell rather than necessarily a production experiment. But I commissioned that photographer because I saw something in that book that was a direction I was going in. And then we ended up working together on numerous projects over the years, and that was the least commercial thing in their book. So I think it's a challenging thing, and I sometimes appreciate how challenging it is for photographers to try and pitch that, because, as you say, do I show this kind of work? There's almost an element of second guessing of what's light. I think I would say. The most important thing in any portfolio is you show the stuff you love, because that's what people will see, that's what people will then buy, and that's what you do more of. And I think, we all have those jobs that come to us where, for whatever reason, things haven't gone in the way that we would like. And sometimes that makes us fall out of love with them a little bit, maybe. But I think it's really important when you're putting together your work that, you really are, putting in there things that really do excite you, and it's what you want to do more of, because then, I think it will probably show your personality in a book more than trying to, change that for whoever your audience is.
Yeah.
And as I say, I think other people will see and appreciate that and get a sense of who you are and what you do. I think it's quite challenging as well, from a creative director's viewpoint, an art director's viewpoint as well, of looking at somebody's work and suddenly you get a sense of through their book and you go, oh, okay, yeah, I kind of understand this person and what they do and what they could bring to one of my projects. And then suddenly you turn the page, click the button, and you see something totally different. And that's always a challenging thing, because we all want some degree, I guess, of diversity within the work that we do. It's part of us growing creatively, but also it becomes really challenging from a commissioner's point of view, because you think you're buying one thing, but then you've also got this other thing. And it's like you a lot of the time creatively, when we're passing on work to ultimately the client, they want the reassurance that this is the person to deliver that concept that you've sold them and that they've bought.
Sure.
So you've got to make sure that there's enough in that work that you're showing and passing on to say, this is the person that does that thing that we're looking for. So when you see that huge mixture of things, that can sometimes throw you off a little bit in, is this the person, or is it just one project they did was something of what we're looking for? But it's so difficult.
Because I guess if someone comes in, I would imagine if I'd bought my book in, you'd probably come out of the meeting going, what is it? You probably come out of it and go, okay, well, there's a lot of that one thing, but then there's so much other stuff.
Yeah.
Variety is the spice of life, right? But you echo a lot of advice that I've been given to try and refine down and basically specialize.
Yeah.
I find it, this is a bit of a tangent, I find it hard now in the current climate to be able to specialize down into one thing from an economic point of view.
Right.
Because I think maybe that the jobs are different in size, different in scale, and different in wage.
Right.
So historically, when you were able to kind of present yourself maybe as the photographer who did do that one thing,
right.
well, then when that 1 or 2 or 3 jobs came in a year that were big, they were your income. It didn't matter.
Right.
But now, obviously, it's a bit different, and it's I don't know. It just feels a bit tricky. So
yeah, and I think it's always kind of had that, and then can have moments of that being kind of magnified, and I guess that and different people have different strategies around how to deal with that. So sometimes, I've seen photographers that would almost have 2 or 3 totally different sets of books, and it's almost like they've packaged them almost like they're different personas of their sort of personality and expertise. Right. I've seen also people kind of grouping those together probably in the same space, but it's more of a project-based thing. So the project itself is therefore a very different thing that this kind of person does. It's so challenging in terms of for the photographers, and when I look at it, and I totally sort of see and appreciate it. But I guess what probably is a good thing to do is, and I appreciate this is a harder thing online on your website, but if you've got the opportunity to sort of pass on and share work, when you've got that initial sort of conversation and contact, it's tailoring that book to that person, because I'm sure that for certain audience members, you might be, Tom as one thing, and to another set, you might be Tom as another part of what you do. Right. And I think targeting in that way is important. And like I say, I appreciate that's not always sort of possible, and it is harder to do online. But equally, I think there are ways. I think in the same way of somebody having 2, 3 physical books, it's quite easy, I guess, on a website to then compartmentalize and feel like, oh, okay, I'm in a different part of this person's world now. But I do think that, certainly from an advertising perspective, I tend to I sympathise and empathise with you as photographers, and I also try and see through that, because I'm either in one of two modes. I'm either, as I say, I'm collecting and it's interesting to see a lot of different things, etc. And I think that's when, being open to quite a lot of different things is really important and really inspiring. But then I think you've got the other side, which is if I've got a specific job that I'm looking for, I become more focused, but I can get through whether or not it's something that you have done as a sort of offshoot of something that you're generally known for or did a lot of last year, because then I'm chasing you down at that point in that sense. I know exactly what I'm going for, and it's a matter of where am I going to find it, and then we can talk about how that can be applied to the thing that I'm working on.
Sure. How does it? This kind of brings it on to, because we've had this discussion recently with portfolios. Does it matter to you about seeing printed portfolios versus seeing portfolios kind of presented on iPads or screens? Do you have anything that has really stuck out to you over the years, or does it not really matter, as long as, is it for you a kind of a mix of meeting the person behind the work as well as the?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we still had fairly regular sort of portfolio sessions in my last agency before moving in-house. So that would have been, 5 years ago. And I personally really enjoyed it. And I think a lot of my team also liked, time away from the screen, time away from the desk, time to actually not only look at this work, but to talk to other people, whether it's those that were representing the photographers or whether it's other people within your own team, because sometimes you can be in the bubble of, not wanting anyone to be near you because you're kind of thinking. So I've always really enjoyed those moments of getting an opportunity to come away from the screen. And I think that sometimes as well, I think it's really interesting to see how people present their work when it's in a physical form. I still, regardless of the fact that I, love all kinds of technology and will be front of queue on most things, like a lot of us kind of are, there's that side to us. I still like physical things. I think there's nothing like it. So for me, I find it really interesting to see not just the work, but how people are presenting it too. And I don't think it's because I have the experience of remembering the times when everything was on, but I don't think that's the case. I think even I see young teens that love the fact that they're actually out of their phone for 5 minutes, and it becomes a bit more of a group experience rather than just, I've got my head stuck in my phone or in my laptop. So I've always really liked it. I mean, generally there's been a mixture of, you'll have, some beautifully printed books, which I like, because one of the things as well that I think people perhaps don't necessarily think about is most of the agencies I've worked in tends to have fairly terrible ceiling lighting. So of course, all of the, how things look when it's under those conditions, and particularly all the, that sort of stuff. But I can guarantee you that it doesn't matter what agency you go to, every single building will have that terrible lighting. So I think, just bear that.
Which is terrible when you've got plastic sleeves or acetate sleeves.
Plastic sleeves, anything like that is, you know when that's happening when you're walking to the area where all the books are laid out, because everyone's just kind of bent over trying to actually see it. So and I think that's a shame, because part of you also appreciates and again empathises and I don't think it hugely gets in the way, but let's face it, anything that's preventing people from seeing your work is a barrier that you really should be trying your best to remove.
It's always that thing for photographers, I think, of finding the balance between, as you said, tailoring a portfolio for the client and managing to do that in a way that's not going to break the bank every time you need to change the portfolio. And there's always this thing between double-sided printing or using acetate if you've got a printed portfolio, because obviously with acetate it's much easier and cheaper to change stuff. Whereas with a double-sided printed portfolio, you change the order and everything needs to change, you know. So it's
totally.
I do a mix of iPad and printed for that very reason, that I can show them a more kind of overarching portfolio and then have targeted like projects that I think are relevant to them. And sometimes I don't even bring out the printed portfolio, you know. It's just,
I think that's a great thing to do. I think having the two together, I think, is really important, because the reality is that, you know, in the advertising world, your things will be both digital and physical. So I think to get a sense of, you know, that person's work in both of those spaces, I think is really important. And I guess also the other thing that I like about the, you know, the iPad and sort of printed kind of approach is, a lot of the time with the iPads too, is that, you know, we will see almost like little offshoots of things. So it might be, for example, that somebody has, you know, created a series of images, but then actually there was, you know, a few little kind of, you know, more 5-second clips that were done as part of it, etc. Or, you know, you might get a sense again of the, you know, the sort of scale of it through how it's presented on screen, or, you know, sometimes even little, you know, behind the scenes moments, so you can get a sort of sense and appreciation for the production. And it's like, there's something about that being on an iPad where, again, I think it's just because it's therefore a swipeable thing, you know, rather than that kind of lifting of the page. And I think, you know, we're all sort of programmed to constantly flick through content. And I think it allows you, I guess, as photographers, to be able to perhaps look at the iPad in more of a, you know, a bite size, here's lots of different things kind of a way, because, you know, that's what we're used to seeing in our feeds every single day. So it's an experimental place for you to show your work, whereas I guess your traditional sort of printed book would almost be your core of, this is who I am, what I do, and what I want more of.
Yeah. Okay, that's. I think that's some really good tidbits for photographers there. Now, I'm conscious that, you know, you have recently brought out this book, Ideas About Creating Ideas, and part of the reason we wanted to get you on was, you know, to talk about this and to talk about, you know, there's some subjects that you tackle in the book, such as dealing with creative lows, and I think it's something, especially over the last couple of years, that a lot of photographers that I know have suffered with. COVID was especially bad for this, because it brought everyone out. It kind of changed everyone's rhythm, and it kind of, you know, some people felt really inspired by it, and other people were kind of just knocked sideways by it. And so there was a lot of people trying to refine their mojo, I guess. So, yeah, what thoughts do you have on that, and what's tell us a bit more about the book, and then maybe we can go into that.
I mean, I must say that the book itself actually came out of me preparing for another podcast. So we might have another book after this.
Hey, that's fine. That's great.
So I did a podcast. I think it was sort of mid last year. You know, talking about sort of creativity, and in preparation for that, I'm a big preparer. I was like, okay, well, what can I talk about? And also that week I had like a mentoring session with a group of young filmmakers, and another sort of session too. And of course, you sit there and say yes to all this stuff, and then you think, fuck, what am I going to talk about? And I started, as all good projects do, with a blank sheet, and I started to just write, okay, well, what would I kind of go back and tell myself, kind of thing. And then I had sort of 10 things. Following day, I had 20. By the end of the week, I had nearly 100 kind of little tidbits of information. And I thought, well, that's not even a podcast. That's a book. And that's what I decided to write. So it turned into a personal project, but also I did it really not for me, but for other people, because I think that anything that helps anybody at any stage of their career, I think is really useful. And I guess from a photography perspective, you don't always have what I have, for example, in terms of that connection with other people, regularly, because you're sort of independent in that sense. So I guess, I would describe the book as a bit of a creative companion in that sense. It's something where I've talked about a lot of different sort of topics, subjects, and their sort of principles, creative principles, tips, tricks, bits of advice, bits of insight. And I've not gone particularly deep on them. That will be something that I do for sort of further down the line in other books. I just wanted to get a breadth of things so that you could literally open this book up, and within 2 minutes, you'll just get a little bit of something to kind of think about, something to try, something to consider. And I think that's really important. And I guess from a creative lows perspective, I think that one of the first things to kind of note on that is you're not the only person. And I think that sometimes if you're having a creative low, it can really feel like, it's you start to get a little, I'll be honest, I'm kind of a bit in that moment myself this week. Purely, I think it's because, the book's done and that's been completed. And you have that sense of, okay, well, what next? What do I kind of do? That sort of fidgety side of creatives. And I think that, we're so used to as well seeing people's creativity being shared with us all the time, and we want to absorb it on social media. And of course, the classic sort of challenge with that is it feels like everyone else is doing well, doesn't it? Because that's what we share on social
all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like what you don't see is the bits where people behind all of that stuff, no matter how prolific they are creatively, might also be having a challenging time. And I think that, that does sort of skew things a little bit. But I think one of the sort of big important things as well, and I think this is really hard to do generally, I think personally, I sort of struggle with this myself, is, it is kind of talking about it. And I think, other people going through it, and even me mentioning that then and you saying, yep, happens all the time. I think, it's really important, like with all things, sort of connected to sort of the impact on our mental health, is to get together and talk to other people. Because I would imagine that if you had the courage to say to somebody, do you know what, I'm kind of struggling with, whether it's a certain project or whether it's a thing or whether it's just, I don't know what I'm doing, that connection and conversation is something where I think the person you talk to is more likely going to go, God, you know what, I'm glad you said that. I'm kind of in the same boat.
Well, exactly. But that's exactly one of the core reasons why we started this whole podcast in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
We wanted to have these conversations. We wanted to make sure that people that they knew that they weren't alone.
Right.
We've been very open and honest about our mental health, and how, I personally really struggled through COVID.
Yeah.
I'm a very people orientated person, and it's something that was taken away from me.
Right.
And then I had an 18-month low.
Yeah.
But we started the podcast and everything's now luckily back on track. But it's really tough. So the more people who do talk about it, and the more people who are open and listening and open to helping, it can only be a good thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think as well, for me, it's like there's such a creative energy when you connect with other like-minded people too, and whether that's over, the challenges of, oh yeah, me too, that's a problem, and talking about it, or whether it is, a kind of super positivity of, we're in the middle of making something together. I think, for me, that creative energy, I mean, I always call it the giggle, because that's how it manifests in me. It's like, creativity, I think, is like the most powerful thing ever. I really, really do. Mm-hmm. I think from a human perspective, creativity gives us everything, and we're nothing without it. And I think that, for me, on a personal level, making something, you get that moment when you've gone from nothing, or I don't know what the hell it is, or what the hell am I going to do, and the low side of stuff, to suddenly something happens. And I do audibly giggle sometimes. And I think, that's a good barometer of, this has got something to it. But also for me, it reminds me of why I do it. And I think that I look for that giggle in as many places as I can. And I think that that happens quite a lot as well. And I think this is really good, or a helpful thing from my perspective when it comes to a project is, sometimes on a creative low, that can be because you're almost tired of the project or the thing. And you could be a bit, shiny new objects, please. I want to move on to the other stuff. And I think that sometimes when you're working with somebody else, and when you're collaborating on things, it's when you can spark that energy again a little bit. And I think it then makes you almost fall back in love with it too. And I think one of the things I love about what I do in my day job is that, by the time we get to the shoot, I kind of, I know what this campaign is in my head, and it's easy to kind of almost be, okay, I want to move on to the next idea, because, by the time production comes, I've probably presented it, endless times to different people. It's gone through the protection with the client to make sure the idea remains intact. But the minute you get on set with the photographer, where it's quite new in their world, but also suddenly they're bringing their expertise alongside yours, and it brings the energy again because it freshens it back up. So I think for me, the connection with people in any work that you're making, I think has the ability to bring that sort of giggle back out of you and to get you to kind of fall back in love with it again. Because ultimately everything we're doing is there to have an impact on other people. So, the more other people are part of that process of making, it kind of surprises and delights you as well. So, imagine what that work will be like when it, gets out to people that know nothing of the story so far. They just see the finished piece. And I think that's, that's something to remind ourselves of a lot of the time.
I think one thing that photographers find difficult is the majority of photographers, if they don't have a studio or they're not working in-house somewhere, it's the solitary nature of your job. And the fact that for some photographers, that collaboration isn't going to be there all the time because they're so used to kind of working on their own or working on smaller projects. So is there anything else that you kind of, quite often for me personally, to kind of rejuvenate my creative process, I quite often have to seek out things that are different, but I find inspirational. And that might be spending time outside. It might be going to art galleries. It might be just the case of putting away all kind of screens and looking at a good old fashioned book, but it's something that I have to, invest time in and proactively seek out to try and kind of reignite those kind of that passion in the visual image. What other things did you come across when you were writing the book that you felt were nice little things that people could try?
I think the daily practice of getting yourself away from not just the screen, but the kind of moment you're in terms of, trying to think or to force thinking, or, I think is really important. I talk a lot about, input being as important as output. I talk about, kind of being kind to yourself, giving yourself kind of room. And I think that's part of, there's a lot in the book of just small things that you could do as part of just the way that you work every single day. I think that's kind of super important to just have as part of your, working practice. But also, I guess it's not just part of your working practice, but I think it's something that becomes, the way that you do things, but also it's being okay with that. It's all right to not be able to crack that thing by, that day particularly, or just being okay with, what? All I'm going to do today is absorb things, and that is my thing. Because I think a lot of lows as well. For me personally, I don't know if it's the same with you both, but it's creative lows tend to happen quite a lot when you don't feel like there's any progress being made in some way, shape, or form.
Oh yeah.
That's where low comes for me. It's like, and it doesn't matter what you've done. Like I said, it's just written a book, just got this out, just did whatever, and it's like it doesn't matter, because suddenly it's almost like you come off of the high of that, and then suddenly you've got the low again because you're either stuck or you don't know what's next, and I think that's such a challenging thing. One thing that I do think, and this is something that's happening at the moment for me, is not just doing something different in terms of even in the world of photography. Find something creative that you just are vaguely interested in and go do it. So for me, the beginning of this year, started to learn to play the drums.
All right.
Never done it before in my life. I occasionally sort of hit some sticks on a sofa when I was a kid, but I thought, you know what? I actually saw a video over Christmas of Chad Smith from the Red Hot Chili Peppers just playing drums for an hour and a half. Best thing I'd ever seen. And I thought, I want to do that. And for me, that is obviously a creative thing. But it has made such an impact on my actual job creativity, purely because of the energy I get from it. It's a totally unrelated thing to what I do, but nothing gives me that energy like it. Because suddenly as well, it's not just the energy of kind of being Animal from the Muppets on the drums every kind of day, but I think it's suddenly I am the student again. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes when we've got a lot of experience, that can sort of breed a sense of, okay, well, I know that, and you could start to potentially get sort of cynical about things, etc. But I don't have that. I have the childlike joy of, I don't know how to do this thing. It's creative and I do it. Right. And I think the other side of it is as well for that particular, and I think there's a lot of hobbies that do this. I don't care about the output. I don't want to be in a band. I don't want to make a song. I just do it because I love it. And I think that's something that we can forget, because I guarantee that I felt like that about the job that I've been doing every day for the past 25 years. But over time, it becomes more job than wow, this is incredible. And I think bringing something else that does that, that's another creative thing, I feel energized and just happy again, and I think that elevates my mood, and I think it changes my perception on more of the day job things that I'm doing, and I bring that energy back into it.
What type of drumming are you doing? I sort of imagine you to be like a double kick drum, triple pedal. Oh yeah, like a hair metal kind of like full on
upside down Slipknot.
Well, it's quite funny actually, because during lockdown I did grow my hair, and I said to Emma the other day, imagine if I still had my lockdown hair while I was doing drums now. And I think it's tricky. I think like a lot of creative things, I think what you want to do and what actually you're naturally good at is can be totally different. And I think it's probably true
that's
of drums.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing to say, but I also think it's a point that a lot of people take a long time to admit to themselves.
Totally.
Because people have a vision of who they are and who they want to be, but it isn't necessarily, as you said, who they actually are. And actually discovering that and realizing what your real strengths are takes quite a lot of courage. I think, to go back to your earlier point, I think, again, one of the reasons photographers struggle when, and it's not just photographers, but any kind of freelance creative, is that when you hit those kind of lows and you're not feeling inspired, the secondary aspect of that is this kind of panic that sets in about well, what am I going to do? Because I've still got to pay the bills, and I'm not getting the work, and I'm not feeling excited, and I'm not chasing the work, and I'm not getting the work, and it becomes this vicious cycle. And I think, lockdown again was a terrible time for a lot of creatives in that sense of well, in a way it was a terrible time, and in a way it was a kind of interesting time because there was no choice. Productions weren't happening, so you couldn't necessarily. You just had to kind of get on with it. But that's I don't really know what my point is with this, but I think it's an aspect that's worth kind of mentioning, because I feel like quite often it's overlooked that and to go back to the point you were saying about, if there's also a mistake that people make, which is, as you said, you do the drums and you know that there's no necessarily, you don't need to make anything of it. You just do it because you love doing it.
Right.
There's a sense, we get told quite often, find something you love and then do it, and you'll never work a day in your life. And that's utter bullshit.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, you find something you love and you turn it into a job, unless you're careful, you will learn to resent it, and it will kind of almost destroy you. You have to find ways and put measures in place that allow you to step back from it and find these other things that keep that spark alive and don't let you kind of become cynical with it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I talk about a little in the book in terms of, some jobs feed your bank account and some jobs feed your soul. And I think that if you're lucky enough to have a creative life where that is also how you make a living, I think for me, it took me a long time to separate those two things. So by that, I mean, I poured myself into my day job, creatively, because that was it. That was my entire life. And I think it took me a long time to realize that as a creative, it's not everything that I make or do will be what happens within that day job. And I think as I certainly, became a creative director and therefore was slightly removed from the making of things, because it was, lots of kind of meetings, etc. That was a bit of a struggle, but I realized, well, okay, well, this is fine, because again, there's other joys of, seeing the sort of energy in other people and helping them do their best work, etc. So suddenly, there was a bit of kind of light there too. But I think also, to be okay with some things that I was doing were because they were there to kind of pay the bills, and then I would have other kind of creative outlets. And I know that's slightly different in terms of if you're in a creative low and you're, as a freelancer needing that job to kind of get the money in. But again, I think it might be that creatively you're looking at, okay, well, I know that this is an area where I can, potentially have a regular income. It might not be the stuff I want to shoot, or it might not be the situation I want to kind of be in, but it's a slightly separate thing. I think what becomes really challenging is if you try and make both of those things amazing, in terms of it's the best photography job in the world and I'm going to get, amazing regular income from it. I think is great if you can do it. But I think sometimes you've got to decide and be okay with, okay, well, I'm going to take this path because I see it as a way of actually putting food on the table, but I'm not going to allow that to, sort of take my total creative energy away from me, or, to see just what makes you happy creatively may or may not be part of that. I think is important.
And so I guess that kind of the last thing I wanted to ask really on that vein then is what tips do you have for kind of following through an idea to a finished production? Is there methods that you've brought into play to kind of keep that discipline and to keep you on the right track?
I think for me, creatively, I think a lot of people, including myself, strive for perfection, because that's part of who we are, and that's part of mastering our craft. I think one of the sort of changes, I guess, that I've made just to my outlook is it's better to have something that's done that isn't quite right than it is to have the perfect thing that exists only in my head. And so I took up painting, so portrait oil painting a few years ago, and through my learning again of that, making myself a student again, which had worked wonders for me. But I never really kind of had sketchbooks and things like that. That wasn't really part of. I'd have notes, obviously, that I'd write down ideas, etc., for sort of campaigns and all that sort of side of stuff, but not in an artful way. And somebody kind of said, "Well, your sketchbook is only for you; it's not for anybody else." And it kind of changed my perception of things, because it almost gave me permission to be okay with things not necessarily working out well. And I think what that's, or the impact that's had on me in only just really the last few years is to just kind of, get things done, fall in love and learn to finish things. I think that, creatively, we all like the new shiny objects, and we can all have endless things on the go that we just don't finish. But I think it's really important to actually follow through on those things and to actually have a thing. I think part of it for me as well was a bit driven by social media, because I was being creative every day and I wasn't sharing a damn thing. So I think there's a part of it where you're like, I've got to show something. So I think following through with something that wasn't perfect. I mean, one of my projects that I did, which again, it was a personal project, and I put it out into the world, and it was by no means perfect, but it was a thing and I wanted to do it and I shared it. That piece of work resulted in the musician Prince seeing it, and then he got in touch with me and we worked together up until his passing.
Right.
That was
That's
not
awesome.
a perfect piece of work. That was a thing that I was like, I kind of want to do this. I'll do it. And I thought, he had a sort of album out at the time, and I thought, well, I'm going to share this thing because it's the strategic sort of advertising side of my brain. What a perfect moment to share it. And I think that being okay with that not being perfect is like, you just don't know. And that could have stayed inside me, because I never would have got it to a place that was, the vision in my head, and it wouldn't have gone anywhere. And look at all the stuff that happened after that moment was because I shared something imperfect and I just finished it. I got it done.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
I think there's a lot of lessons there for people to learn, because I know a lot of, myself included, kind of you sit on these projects that you just never kind of, they're always like 80% done, but you're just trying to get them over the line.
Yeah, totally. I think that, there's nothing like finishing something. I think does so many different things. I think that it teaches you something because it's kind of completed. We always have that thing in us when we certainly look back on our work too, and we almost want to go in and sort of retweak things. Don't do it. Move on. Bring that stuff into your next project. I think is really key. I think another thing that I do too, and I've actually only just this year started to adapt this, but at the end of every year, I am always really, really kind of good at looking back on the year, but also thinking about what next year is going to be about. And I tend to, over that sort of Christmas break period, sort of look back, go, okay, what was I happy with? What kind of happened? And what do I want to make next year about? And it's not, I don't do New Year's resolutions as such, but I have what is a thing that I want to finish? What do I want that kind of year to be? And that's something that I've always done. But what I did this year that was different is I had that feeling of looking back in December, but in January, I actually sat down and on a piece of paper somewhere, I have got what I want 2024 to be. And I have put down, 3 or 4 things of, well, what is it that I want other people to see in me when they think, oh, Martin, the creative. And I've kind of put that down. And that really is my kind of guiding light for this year, in terms of making sure that the things that I do are things that are connecting to that, so that when I come to December this year, I can look back at those things and see that they've all actually gravitated and built towards something, rather than just there's a whole series of random things that I've created. And I think it's made a difference to me even in these first few months, because when I have different either projects or opportunities, I then go back to that sheet and say, is it part of building that? Is it connected to doing that and to build that reputation or experience or knowledge in that area? And if it is, I do it, and I try and get those things done. And they can be small things, they can be big things. They could be as small as put one article somewhere, or say yes to that podcast so that you can go and talk to other people about creativity. And it's like all of those ticks in the boxes. I know when it comes to December, I'll be able to look back and think about all the things that I've done, rather than think, oh God, yeah, I've still got those 8 projects in my head and I didn't do any of them. I think that makes a big difference. The small stuff can make a massive difference, because completing things and giving a sense of progress gives you creative energy like nothing else.
But also, I hope you don't get to December and then go, God, do you know what? I really wish I hadn't done that podcast.
The only way I might think that is if what I did last December over Christmas, which was to write a book. So if this podcast spawns another book, which is highly likely knowing myself, then yeah, this Christmas. So I'll apologise to my wife for if this Christmas I'm also working on designing a book.
Sorry,
you
Emma.
can blame Tom and Greg.
Well, listen, we're probably getting to the end, towards the end of this podcast. But before we kind of wrap it up completely, we always have two questions that we ask our guests. This is our desert island section. So let us hear it. What are your? Let's start with your camera, because I think your book one, you've probably, you've got probably a list. So let's hear about what would be your desert island camera to start with.
Okay. I have a feeling that other people on your podcast may not have mentioned this. Not from the podcasts that I've heard so far. And you might have to get Google ready for this one.
Okay, we like that.
All right.
So my camera is going to be a Vivitar LF 110 film camera from early 1980s.
I own that.
Did you?
I own that. Where is it? I actually have one. I inherited it from a relative.
There you go.
How bizarre.
That is why. So I'll tell you why. So for me, I obviously rely on, brilliant people like yourselves to be able to, kind of technically find the right things to deliver on imagery. So, I'm kind of quite, I've been spoiled, I guess, in my career by people like yourselves. And so when I was kind of thinking of my answer to this, knowing that you always asked all of your guests this, I went back in my head to really a moment, and this camera effectively was something that my dad had. And when I was younger on holidays, he would give me the camera and a roll of film, and I'm sure it was so that I would go away for a bit, so he could sunbathe in the Spanish seaside.
That's how my career started.
But what I did was I would go and do shoots with I shouldn't say this out loud, but I'm going to. But I used to do shoots with my little teddy bear. In loads of different places, and I just loved it. And to have something like a camera where I could create my own little world, but to also capture it. And what always kind of amused me was I would go back to my dad within like about 5 minutes and go, "Can I have another roll of film?" And he'd, it must have cost him more than the holiday to take me there. But it was the joy of doing it, but also, of course, we didn't know what the result was until we got home. And I think that for me, it's not just the memories that camera brings me, but I think a little bit of what we were talking about earlier is it just, I'm kind of getting a bit goosebumpy even talking about it now, because it just reminds me and connects me to kind of what was important. I think, it's so easy now, obviously, to kind of shoot stuff, to instantly look at it. I didn't have that. There was all of the happy accidental stuff of double exposure or whatever else it kind of happened to be, which was an absolute joy. But also it was just the fact that I guess, the tech and the kit wasn't what it was about. It was about the imagery that I've got of basically my Teddy Charlie in what must have been, I mean, if he had an Instagram account back in the 80s,
he'd be an influencer.
He would be an influencer. And I think that for me was like, that's what I thought about when I thought of the answer to this question, because it's that, the childlike joy and wonder of creating imagery that just evoked something in me it's still with me now. I think that's easy to forget in a world full of instant things and technology and AI. So that was why my choice was, and I'm sure nobody else has.
No one else has said it. But listen, is it this size? Was it a really dinky, tiny little thing?
No, do you know what?
So I don't have the Vivitar. I got it wrong. I've got the Pentax 110.
Right.
But to give people an idea of the size, if you're watching on YouTube, that is a normal 35mm point and shoot. And then that's the 110 film.
Yeah, this one was. He had one that was a bit like that, but I couldn't. I must admit, I remembered the thing rather than the name, and I was googling, and then I started to delve into a whole realm of sort of late 70s, early 80s cameras, which was good fun. Those big cube flashes that used to stick on.
Oh yeah,
and
love all of that.
Yeah, it was great. And then I saw
they're coming back.
Are they?
Yeah, there are companies making retro flash designs. You know, like the old fan ones that you would literally kind of bring out, and they'd be a flower petal.
Amazing.
There's companies bringing them out now for digital cameras.
I must be booking a holiday with Charlie the teddy bear this year. Then I think we can make that Instagram account happen.
We can make magic again. So was it? Just to reiterate, it was a Vivitar
a Vivitar LF110 was the one that I found, and I saw an image of it, and I was like, "That was
it almost
the
looks
one."
like a spy camera.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a really lovely one that I also got as well. A few years later, where effectively it was literally like a clip-on lens to a piece of kind of 110 film, and it made me feel a bit like I was taking those sneaky shots in a sort of
James
early
Bond-esque
80s
way.
kind of It was, and honestly, to me, I absolutely loved it. It was I think it was a lot of the keyring as well, but
wow.
yeah, the joy of imagery and analog things, and is why I've chosen that. No other reason of choosing that, let's face it.
No, love it.
Perfectly good reason.
Love it.
A perfectly good reason. Okay, so what about your Desert Island book?
So Desert Island book, I think is a really difficult one. You're right in terms of, there were probably a sort of few choices in terms of, what I would kind of choose here. I nearly kind of, at the moment, I'm sort of visually fascinated by landscapes, because it's something that's working its sort of way into my painting. So, that's a bit of a sort of area of focus for me at the moment. But I think thinking about the brief, as I do, as a good creative director, I would choose Tim Flack's book on dogs, The Dog Gods.
Nice.
And the reason is because, again, joy is at the heart of it. I think, being a recent dog owner and not actually having, my own dog. And it was something that was a dream of my wife's, and something that we did a couple of years ago, and just brings absolute daily joy into our life. And I figured, if I'm going to be on a desert island, which, let's face it, is a challenging place for somebody with my colour hair, then I want to be filled with, I want a companion. And if I can't have a companion, then I'll find it in Tim's work. And I think, again, it's the emotional connection to it. It's, you can't look at any of those images without just feeling a little something inside. And I think, what a perfect book to have on a desert island.
They are beautiful. Are you just about to recommend Dogs Underwater?
No, I was going to recommend William Wegman's book that he did with his, I can never say the name of the dogs, but they're Weimaraners. Weimaraners? They're like, he had a couple of them, and he used to dress them up. This was kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And I saw a couple of years ago at Arles, I saw this beautiful series of portraits that he'd done where he dressed one of them up as the Pope.
Right.
Shot it on like 8x10 Polaroid. And they're just fantastic. But I used to have one of his books, and it was all about these dogs of his that he would just, they were so docile that he would just be able to pose them and take these beautiful studio portraits of them. Wow. But definitely worth a look, because they're very funny.
Can I bring the tone down slightly away from, obviously, the proper photographers? I mean, not that the book I'm just about to recommend isn't a proper photographer. Actually, he's obviously a brilliantly talented guy, but the premise of it is far more silly, maybe, than what you guys have suggested. There was a book that I got given years and years ago called, I think it's, I've got it here, it's Underwater Dogs, by a photographer called Seth Castile. And he threw a ball into the water and had everything set up under the water and caught the moment. Have you seen this?
Yeah.
Honestly, it's so, you talk about joy. That book is so much fun. Yeah. I've always loved it. Yeah. But it's slightly less maybe high end than Tim and the other book. But it is good. It's a good laugh.
Well, there you go. You've got two extra things to take away and have a little look at now.
Yeah,
And maybe
definitely.
that will be what sparks off the next book.
It
We
might
thought
be,
it was going to be
mightn't it?
about creativity, but it's actually going to be a book about your dog.
Well, there you go. I think my last book was supposed to be a book of short stories and ended up being a book about creativity. So it's only fair, I think.
So listen, Martin,
Nice.
thank you so much for coming on. If people want to find you, obviously we're going to put a link to the book and your website and your social media in the show notes. But for people who aren't going to read the show notes and just listen, where can they find you?
Sure, yeah, you can find me at martinhoment.com. You can also find me at martinhoment.art, where you'll see some of my paintings and also my work with prints. And you will see me in social as Red Fox Bandit, where you'll get an array of art, quips, books, and maybe even some drumming coming later on, and perhaps even some early insight into my new book about dogs. Who knows?
Dog strumming.
Yeah, dog strumming, maybe. Why not?
I'd buy that.
Awesome.
I mean, you throw a stick once. Brilliant. Well, listen, Martin, thank you so much. Right, listen, before we hung up and you just said, I've got this thing, and I'm not going to build it up how you built it up, just in case, but you have something to say that you were going to try and shoehorn in, but because me and Greg are so inexperienced, we didn't get around to being able to shoehorn it in. So the floor is yours.
Slash, I might have forgotten about it in the moment, but I think there was just something that I heard the other day, which actually was through sort of my new creative obsession of drumming, but it's really, I think, interesting to bring it into the conversation around photographers working with creatives, art directors, creative directors. And I think that it was about how you need to interpret what we're saying in terms of what we're looking for, because we don't have, or I certainly don't, some art directors might, but have the right language to know what it is that I'm asking for to be able to get you to kind of deliver on it. And I think that's, I totally again empathize with you trying to translate what that kind of means. But I just heard a lovely story the other day where Little Richard's Tutti Frutti, where at the beginning he says "What babaloo babalot bamboom." That wasn't supposed to be in the record. That's actually him telling the drummer what he wanted at the beginning of the record.
How good.
And I think that for me was a perfect encapsulation of what it's probably like to work with me on set, where I'm not saying to you, can you do a couple of kicks, a hi-hat and a snare there? I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying, what babaloo babalot bamboom. And I think that, it really sort of brought me into the moment of shooting with people. And, again, it's the ability to be able to turn that into an actual, kind of drum groove. But
I guess that's part of the essence of creativity, is to have that flexibility. Because that reminded me of there's a Gorillaz song, isn't there? Where with is it Shawn Ryder?
Right.
I might get this wrong.
It's there. Yeah, it's there. Yeah, because he said
basically all they got out of him was that, and they turned that into the song. It's kind of sometimes you've just got to go with that kind of flow, and if something presents itself in a way, you just go with the path it presents.
I mean, it's such a sort of double moment in terms of it's not only a happy accident of let's put that on the record, but I never knew that was actually him trying to explain to the drummer what he was looking for. So there's a couple of different things in there, but I thought it was so fascinating.
It's brilliant because also happy accident, it becomes super, super iconic.
Yeah. Exactly.
Love it.
There you go. That was him explaining something in the way that I might explain what I'm looking for a photographer, but you can't put my explanation in place of the image, unfortunately.
Well, I think we've just got the title of your new book, though.
There you go. What babaloo babalot bam dogs, maybe.
Brilliant.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the show. If you would like to find out more, you can find us on YouTube, which is just youtube.com @expose negative, and we are @xnegative on Instagram. And if you'd like to follow us personally, you can find myself They're as at Greg Fennell, which is GregFunnell, and Tom can be found as tombarnes.com, which is TomBarnesDotcom. Thanks very much.